So, like many of you probably did the same, we kind of ran out the clock as best we could on summer vacation, basically traveling up to the day before school started. So, you may have noticed I wasn't here last Sunday because I was in the promised land known as Montana. Uh, Wonderful, wonderful place. If you haven't been, it's fine. Stay here. Um, But we were traveling, and we were off, visiting Dane's mom, and then we went to Billings, and we visited friends, and did all those things that you do. And one of the things that you do, or that I do anyway, on those rare times I actually get back to Miles City, which is the small town in eastern Montana I more or less grew up in, is you sort of have to, you got to take the tour and see all the sights you saw as a kid, which takes about 8 minutes. Does not take long. And of course I did this, and of course my kids did not go with me because they don't care. But I had to do it, and I like to drive around, and I drove by the elementary school where I went to school when we first arrived. And one of the things I noticed right away when I pulled up next to the school is the same playground equipment that I played on in the 80s is still there. And my first thought was, this school board got to get their act together. Get a little professionalism going on here. But I do actually remember, it's hard to see in the picture, but there's like this like dome thing and like a swing set. And in the fourth grade, or at least at the time, was the fourth grade area of the playground. That was it. Right, like that's what we were given for recess, and so we moved to Montana the summer before my fourth grade year. Before that, I was attending a different elementary school, obviously, and that elementary school was situated basically in the heart of Silicon Valley in California. That was a different elementary school experience than on the plains of eastern Montana. So. One of the things that I loved about my elementary school in the heart of Silicon Valley is that during recess, they had an entire room full of Apple II computers that you could go use, and including, I'm not kidding, 6 copies of the Oregon Trail. So you could always get an Oregon Trail floppy disk if you wanted one. And there was no better way, as far as I was concerned, to spend a recess time than to go where the Apple IIs were and check out a Oregon Trail disk. And that's what I did for the longest time. Well, as you might expect, Lincoln Elementary in Miles City, Montana does not have a room full of Apple II computers for kids to come and use. We did have some computers. It wasn't quite like that bad. But the first day of school at this new place with kids that I didn't know, most of whom had already been in school together for a number of years by that point. So they all knew each other. And here we are kind of trapped at recess in this small little piece of ground with 2 pieces of playground equipment and not much to do. It was an interesting time in my life. So much so that I honestly don't actually have a lot of strong memories from childhood, but that first day of school, and really that first week of school, trying to figure out where in the world I was and what it is that I was supposed to be doing and who it is that I might be able to make friends with and that sort of things, was frankly an anxious time for a young Jeremy. And I think that's something that probably most of us, if we think back, will have a time, that we relate to that. Maybe it was the first time we went to the new school. Maybe it's when we got up to the high school and there were all these kids we didn't know. Maybe it's when we did move to a new town or whatever it was. I think we all have those times in our lives where we recognize that we are out of place, that we are the thing that is different than what everybody else around you. And the other thing I can tell you that was true then, that is still probably incredibly true now, is that nobody in Montana is impressed if you tell them you moved there from California. In fact, quite the opposite. School is one of those interesting times in our lives where, yes, we learn the reading and the writing and the arithmetic and all that kind of stuff. But school is often that time where we also learn all those other skills that we need in life to get through. And one of those skills that we have to learn is how do we make it through those times and those moments when we have no idea what's going on and we don't know what's going to happen next. I knew how my previous school worked. I did not know how this new one did, but everyone else seemed to. So it seemed for me for a long time that everything was just sort of happening around me and to me, right? And I had very little say or control over what was going on. I've heard from a lot of my teacher friends, of which I have several, that one of the most interesting things about back to school time, for those especially who work in multiple grade levels, one of the most interesting things about back to the school time is always the kindergartners. Because for some of those a lot of the kindergartners, the ones that maybe didn't go to preschool, or in our very own church here, the 3-year-old class in preschool is always very interesting, and we're going with the word interesting. Those first week and definitely 2, because for many of them, it's the first time they've ever run into this thing that as adults we know of as a schedule, right? Things happen at a certain time because that's when they happen, right? And it's always really interesting to watch kids encounter that idea for the first time. That, yes, you may want to play outside, but it's not actually play outside time right now. Right now, it's this time over here. And that is not something that you, 3-year-old or kindergartner, get to be in charge of. That is one of those lessons that we hopefully learn in school, is that there are times in our lives when we are not actually in charge. There are times in our lives when things happen that happen whether we want them to or not. And the question isn't, is that going to happen? The question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, if you've ever been around a lot of 3-year-olds or /kindergartners, you will know that sometimes the thing that they choose to do about it is interesting. And it can take time for them to figure out that no matter what they do, the schedule probably isn't going to change, and they will eventually have to figure out how to participate when they are asked to participate in the thing that everyone else is participating in. Something that we are probably so used to, now in life that we might forget that there was a time when we had to learn it. And really, in those times and when we're learning that, what we are learning is patience. We are learning that there may be something that we want to do. It may be recess, it may be playing outside, and it doesn't mean it's never going to happen, but it may not be happening right now. And we have to learn how to wait until it is, in fact, the time to do the thing that we want it to do. I think that's one of the great and amazing ways that things like school can teach us important things in life, and that's how we learn things like patience. Because the truth is, we don't always know what's going to happen next. Sometimes we want something to happen, but we don't quite know how to make it happen yet. And so we have to practice our patience and recognize that this may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but it might happen down the road. So Paul, in his letter that we read today, is actually part of what he's trying to do is he's trying to remind the people of Philippi that same thing. Because the people of Philippi actually have a lot of questions. Because Philippi is an interesting place. It's a very important place. It's on a lot of trade routes. It's a great place to start something if you want it to spread, because a lot of people and things move through Philippi. And so it's a smart place for Paul to found a church, and he did. And it's a pretty thriving church, and it's a going church. But one of the things that it is, because everything in Christianity is at this time, is brand new. Meaning that they know that they are a church, and they know what they've learned from Paul, and they know about Jesus, and they know that they are a community, and they know they come together, and that they eat together, but they don't actually know what they're doing. They don't have a book of discipline yet. God bless them. They don't have a bunch of rules yet. They don't have a bunch of expectations yet. They haven't yet to even agree on what day it is they should gather together for worship or how often they should do it, right? Because all of that is still unknown because what they're doing is very, very new. They are basically collectively living through the first day of school as a group, but instead of the first day of school, it's the first day of church. Imagine walking in to, say, this building, but not knowing anything about when we meet or how we meet. And what if nobody knew when we were supposed to meet or how we were supposed to meet or what we were supposed to do? And that was the job of the early church, was to actually figure all that stuff out. And we are blessed today because we get to be the inheritors of everything that they learned and figured out. Eventually, along the way, they decided instead of meeting on Saturday, let's meet on Sunday. And when we meet, let's do this. And maybe we should sing some songs. And maybe we should read from these letters and these books that we have. And over time, it all came together. But Paul's letter is very, very early in the life of this church, and at a time when they are no doubt feeling rather uncertain about who it is and what it is they're supposed to be doing. And so Paul writes to them, and he writes to them this letter mostly because he had an opportunity to do so. Somebody was traveling between where Paul was and Philippi, and of course there is no mail service or UPS or FedEx at this time, so he decided to write a letter because he could. And he'd heard a little bit about what was going on there, and he wanted to write primarily to encourage them. And really what he's encouraging them, what's interesting, in his encouraging of them, he doesn't actually give them the answers to everything that they are looking for, right? He knows they have these questions about the kind of community they should be in, how they should be doing, and what they should be doing. And throughout this whole letter, he doesn't actually spend much time, really at all, addressing the questions about what they should be doing. Instead, he focuses more and more again, like he did today, on how it is that they should be thinking, how it is that they should be behaving, what it is that they should be spending their time worrying about. Or, more importantly, what they should be spending their time not worrying about. Paul knows they're worrying, by the way. And when Scripture says, do not worry, it's assumed that God knows that we worry, right? Because we do. Right? In the same way, when we're extolled to have patience, it's because God knows we're impatient people, right? Nobody, by the way, this morning, under your breath, has otherwise said to me, I'm a really patient person. And if you are, fantastic, good for you. That is not my gift. The same as Carrie Ann. And that's okay. The question isn't, the idea isn't that we never actually should worry. The idea is, what should we do when we do? And what Paul is trying to tell them here is that if you find yourself in a place where you are feeling impatient, if you are finding yourself in a place where you find yourself worrying, and those two things really do go together almost inseparably, what you need to do with that energy is not sit around and not just worry to yourself. But Paul reminds us instead to think on the good things, to focus on the things that we can do something about. Because oftentimes when we are worrying and when we are impatient, it's because we are presented with something we do not feel that we can do something about, that we do not feel we have control over, though perhaps we desperately want it. So what do we do when we hit those moments? Paul reminds us in this letter, instead of worrying and fixating over the things we cannot do and cannot change, we should focus on the good things. We should focus on the things that God gave us. We should focus on those places where we can and in fact do make a difference. We learn that lesson throughout life, that there are things in life that will be outside of our control. As I was thinking about this and back to school and all those sorts of things, you can't help but think about my own kids when they were a lot younger. And I remember this one time when Gavin was really young. I think it was before he'd even actually started to go to school. And we were playing games, but you're playing those games that you play with like a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. So you're playing things like Candyland, right? Played a lot of Candyland. And one of the things the problem we were having as we were playing Candyland is Gavin was getting increasingly frustrated because he kept losing, right? And we played like 3 or 4 games, and I think I won all 3 or 4 of those games. And then finally, Dane looks at me, he's like, would you just let him win? And I'm like, it's Candyland, there's no way to let him win. Right? If you don't remember, Candyland is you just draw a card and you does what it says, right? There are no decisions to be made in Candyland. You are completely and fully at the mercy of the deck of cards, right? So I basically, in order to let him win, had to start cheating. Thankfully, my son was not all that observant, as I was actually drawing 2 cards at a time, picking the worst one for myself, so that I could finally let the kid win. But I also guess the reason why Candyland is one of those games that doesn't survive in our lives much past 3 or 4 years old, right? I don't imagine that, especially like many of you older retired couples get together at night and say, let's play a game of Candyland, right? My guess is that's not what you're doing. But we can learn a lesson. And the lesson, of course, we learned is that there are some things out of our control. But Candyland stops being fun because we recognize that it's not good and it's actually not true, that everything is out of our control. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about basically what's the exact opposite of Candyland. And of course, the exact opposite in Candyland in my mind was chess. Now, I haven't played a lot of chess in my life. I got really enamored with it once when, back in 2008, when part of a program through my seminary, we spent 2.5 weeks in India. And I kind of got paired off with this other guy named Alan, still didn't know him very well, still a good friend today. And one of the places that, one of the games that really inspired and made chess came from India in the 7th century. So there are like chess sets and chess boards like all over that place. And so early on the trip, I had actually bought this chess set right here. It was handmade by somebody. And I bought it in a store for like $4. And Alan and I decided to play. And Alan knew a little bit more about it than I did, so he taught me a little bit of basic strategy. And when you're on this big group tours, what you find out relatively quickly is there's a lot of time when you're not doing anything. And since this is pre-smartphone days and anything like that, Alan and I probably propped up that chessboard on every random surface you could to enjoy a quick game of chess while we whiled our time away, waiting for the bus or whatever it is that we were waiting for. I'm not sure I've actually played a game since. But the one thing about chess that is interesting is between you and your opponent are completely in charge, right? I might not have control over what my opponent does, but I can influence it, as I learned. And he can't control what I'm doing, but he can influence what I'm doing by what he does. But there's nothing that moves a piece on the board other than the two of us. And so in that system and in that setup, we are both completely in charge of the game. Nothing outside of us is going to influence the game, except for that one time somebody knocked the board over. We tried really hard not to yell at them. Chess is interesting, and we like it, and people play it, I think, for that reason. Because it gives us that sense of control, that sense of we know what's going on, and that sense of nothing random is going to happen. Unfortunately, life is no more like chess than it is like Candyland. In Candyland, we have zero control. In chess, we can be fooled into thinking we have total control. But the life that you and I all live, and the world that we all live in, is actually somewhere in the middle. Life, as we play it, and as we live it, is a different kind of game. It's a kind of game that has dice. And I think the best games are the games that actually have dice. Where yes, you can have some strategy in what you're doing. Yes, you have some control of what you're doing. Think about like Monopoly in life, though life has the little spinny thing that never works, right? There is some control. You have some say over what's going on. You have this idea of, do I buy that property? Do I not buy that property? Do I build that hotel? Do I not build that hotel? There's strategy involved, but there's also an element outside of our control that can, if we're not careful, literally send us to jail, which I think is unfair. The world that we all live in, the world that demands patience of us, is a world where some things are in our control, some things we can decide about, some things we have to decide about, sometimes we are responsible to decide about. And at the same time, we live in a world where there's so much outside of our control. That does sometimes feel like a bit of a dice roll. Like, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. I guess we'll have to wait and find out. We live in that world where both of those things are true. Paul is writing to his people to remind them who they are and what it is that they are supposed to be about. And though they are worrying about all these little details, he wants to remind them of what's actually the most important thing. The most important thing is that those folks that Paul are writing to, as Paul himself is, as we all are here today are, every single one of us, we're all beloved children of God. And that while God has a perspective beyond any we will ever have, and while God has the abilities to influence us in our lives and the world around us that we will never have, we were reminded that our peace and our comfort and our care and our hope comes not because we ourselves have that same or can have that same perspective, but we have faith in the one that does. Paul is reminding them that first and foremost, they need to be a people of faith. They need to recognize, yes, there are things that you're not going to be able to control, you're not going to be able to influence. Things are going to happen that you don't expect. And while those unexpected things are happening, God is still God and God is with you. Our faith is for real, and it matters and it's important. So while you figure out all the details about when you should meet and where you should meet and how all that should work, don't lose track of why it is that we're all together in the first place. Remember and focus on the good things. Focus on the things that bring life. Focus on the things that bring joy. Focus on the things that are about loving God, loving neighbor, and loving yourself. Paul wants to remind them of that at the very end of the letter, because there, at the end of the day, is nothing more important than that. So while many of us probably struggle with things like patience and worry, it will crop up in our lives whether we want it to or not. The solution to it is not to go and try to control everything or try to pretend that we can. The solution to it, the way that we find the patience we need, is to have the faith in the one that made us. Have faith in the one who put the whole world together and spin it in motion. Faith in the one who brought us into it. Faith in the one who loved us through it. Faith that God is God and we are not. And that God is good. And because God is good, we can be also. So we will find patience when we find our faith and trust that what God promised was real, that the truth we looked for is there, the peace and hope we want is available. And just like Paul told them so long ago, we are called today to do the same. We are feeling impatient and we're feeling worried. Let us think on the things that are good. Let us think on the things that are joyful. Let us think on the things of God. Amen.